Have you ever noticed how Rome sleeps? Not with silence, but with memory. The city doesn't rest the way others do. It lingers, suspended like candle smoke in a chapel, like a whisper behind heavy velvet curtains. Even in the stillest hours of the night, Rome remembers. Beneath every echoing archway and crumbling ruin, beneath the soft splash of fountains and the quiet footfall of midnight wanderers, this ancient city keeps its secrets. It remembers emperors and martyrs, sculptors and scribes, and the devout footsteps of pilgrims crossing bridges lit by moonlight. But it also remembers what it's not supposed to say. You see, not all of Rome's history is holy. Not all of her legends wear halos, and not all of her popes were saints. Tonight, we step past the incense and into the shadows, into candlelit rooms where holy robes slip from shoulders and golden chalices are used for more than communion. Because once upon a time, in the heart of Christendom, the men tasked with guiding souls to heaven were busy indulging in the most earthly pleasures imaginable. This is a story of power, absolute power, and the kinds of things it whispers to a man when no one dares say no to him. It's about popes who kept mistresses in secret villas, who hosted banquets so decadent they made Roman emperors blush, and who turned the Vatican into a playground of politics, passion, and scandal. Not all popes, of course, but some. And when a man wears the keys of St. Peter while feasting like Bacchus in the shadows, history doesn't forget. It waits. So tonight, let's wander into that forgotten history. We'll move quietly through the corridors of Renaissance palaces, where silk slippers shuffle over marble floors, and guards are paid to look the other way. We'll peer through the keyholes of time and listen in on the secret lives of the world's most powerful men, who were supposed to be holy, but sometimes acted anything but. Before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's drifting off with us from around the world. Now, get comfortable, pull the blanket a little closer, and let's begin with the scandalous popes and their wild, whispered nights. Let's set the stage. It's Rome, late 15th century. The Renaissance is in full bloom, and the eternal city is swelling with painters, poets, spies, and popes. But this isn't the quiet Rome of solemn prayers and cloistered monks. No. This is the Rome of silk-draped salons, of masked visitors slipping through archways under torchlight, of forbidden pleasures whispered behind holy doors. At the very top sits the Pope, not just a man of God, but a king among kings, a ruler with palaces, armies, vaults of gold, and no one to tell him no. And sometimes that was a problem, because some popes, not all, but enough, discovered that when you're the vicar of Christ and the most powerful man in Europe, you can have anything you want: women, wine, art, land, assassins, even orgies in the papal palace, if the mood struck you. And the church, it mostly turned the other cheek. There's a name you'll hear often tonight: Rodrigo Borgia. You might know him as Pope Alexander VI. And if you don't, well, you're in for something. Imagine a man who treated the papacy like a personal empire, a throne of velvet, not of virtue. He didn't just live in luxury, he reveled in it. Rodrigo Borgia held court like a Roman emperor, with feasts that sprawled into the night, music and dancing, and favors traded under the table. He fathered children openly, not in secret, not in shame, but with the same pride other popes had for their theological treatises. His daughter, Lucrezia, was married off like a chess piece. His son, Cesare Borgia, well, he was something else entirely: a cardinal, a general, a killer. And all of it under his father's watchful, approving eye. But here's the thing: Rodrigo wasn't the first, and he certainly wasn't the last. Popes before him dabbled in decadence. Popes after him, well, some turned debauchery into policy. There were papal brothels funded with church money, boys hired to sing at Vatican banquets, masses interrupted for private rendezvous, paintings of saints conveniently covered nude lovers in the corners, and all the while the marble churches glowed, the incense swirled, and the faithful whispered their prayers, never knowing what truly happened after the sun went down. What happens when divine authority meets absolute power? What happens when the gatekeeper to heaven decides he'd rather rule in flesh than in spirit? That's what we'll uncover tonight, not through rumors or fiction, but through letters, chronicles, and dusty Vatican records that were never meant to be read aloud. We'll explore the reigns of popes who lived like kings and sometimes died like villains, popes who drank wine from jeweled goblets and scheduled confession for after the party. We'll wander through palaces where mistresses danced in papal halls, where secret staircases led to scandal, and where the most powerful men in Europe hid their wildest desires behind embroidered robes. And yet, not all of them were wicked. Some were trapped. Some were weak. Some were born into a machine they couldn't stop turning. So as we drift through the candlelit shadows of Renaissance Rome, let's not just judge. Let's observe. Let's listen. And let's remember that history, like the human soul, is rarely pure. It's messy, contradictory, fascinating. And tonight, it's about to get scandalous. Now, let's begin with Chapter 1. Before the scandals, before the banquets and the brothels, before the Vatican doors were locked behind candlelit sins, there was a boy, not in Rome, but in Sativa, a sun-bleached hill town, nestled in the kingdom of Valencia. Sativa was the kind of place where time didn't hurry. The cobbled streets baked under the Mediterranean heat, and the air always smelled faintly of crushed herbs and old stone. If you wandered there in the early 1400s, you'd hear the soft lilt of Valencian being spoken in the markets. You'd see donkeys pulling carts full of figs and olives. And you'd find a quiet people, devout, resilient, bound by both faith and dust. It was here, in 1431, that Rodrigo Lansol y Borja was born. Rodrigo, the boy who would one day become Pope Alexander VI, a name that would come to echo across centuries, not with reverence, but with infamy. His family was not poor, but neither were they powerful. They belonged to that curious middle caste of late medieval Spain, landed, literate, ambitious, but always just one generation removed from obscurity. The Borgias, as they were known in their native tongue, were minor nobles, comfortable enough to eat well, but not so mighty that anyone listened when they spoke. And yet, they were not content to remain in the shadows. Especially one man, Alfonso de Borja, Rodrigo's maternal uncle. Alfonso was sharp, a lawyer by training, a clergyman by circumstance, and a political climber by instinct. He knew, as many quietly did, that the church was not just a place of prayer, but a ladder. And every step on that ladder, from priest to bishop to cardinal to pope, was laid not with holiness, but with human leverage. Alfonso saw promise in young Rodrigo, a spark perhaps, or maybe just a vessel. He arranged for the boy to be educated, not in the monastic solitude most aspiring priests knew, but at the finest legal school in Europe, the University of Bologna. There, Rodrigo would study not just canon law, but the game behind it, and oh, how he played. From the beginning, Rodrigo Borgia understood that knowledge was a mask and charm, a weapon. He wasn't especially pious, not particularly philosophical, but he was observant. He watched how influence moved through a room. He listened to the tone of favors exchanged under candlelight, and he learned when to bow, when to speak, and when to disappear. In Bologna, he was a student of books, but more so of people. By the time he was 22, Rodrigo could quote church fathers in Latin, but more importantly, he could out-negotiate a bishop with a smile. His physical presence didn't hurt either. He was tall, handsome, clean-shaven, at a time when beards made men look tired. He wore rich colors and tailored sleeves. He rode fine horses, and he smiled. Often. People remembered his laugh, the way he greeted even the lowliest servant. He was charming in the effortless way that made others forgive what they should have condemned. When his uncle Alfonso became Pope Calixtus III in 1455, everything changed, and yet nothing changed. Rodrigo was already a man accustomed to the long game, to waiting, but now the door had opened. Nepotism was the unspoken currency of the Renaissance Church, and Calixtus III didn't waste time. At just 25, Rodrigo was made a cardinal, not because he was holy, not because he'd worked miracles, but because he was blood, and blood was the surest path to power. As a cardinal, he was granted wealth beyond imagination. Land holdings, palaces, income from church offices across Europe. But more than that, he was granted proximity to the Curia, to the Pope, to Rome. Ah, Rome, the eternal city. To young Rodrigo Borgia, Rome must have felt like a stage set just for him. She was ancient, beautiful, decaying, and full of contradictions. Priests walked beside prostitutes. Orphans knelt beside marble fountains. Church bells rang out above taverns, packed with wine-soaked laughter. It was a city where saints were carved in stone, and sinners ran the streets. Rodrigo didn't shy away from this world. He embraced it. In public, he was every inch the cardinal. Dignified, composed, measured. In private, he began building a kingdom of his own. He took residence in what would become the Palazzo Borgia, a mansion of silk and stone in the heart of Rome. And inside it, he created a world of pleasure and power. There were tapestries from Flanders, paintings from Florence, wine from Naples, and women from everywhere. One woman especially, Vanozza de Catane, a Roman noblewoman, refined, clever, beautiful in the severe, sculpted way of Roman statuary. She became his mistress, but more than that, his partner. Together they had 4 children, not illegitimate accidents, but proudly acknowledged heirs. In a church that preached celibacy, Rodrigo Borgia raised a family, and the world watched and did not stop him, because Rome had grown used to sin in silk robes. Rodrigo's children were not hidden in shame. They were lavished with titles, raised in privilege, and trained for greatness. One son, Giovanni, would become Duke of Gandia. Another, Cesare, would be made a cardinal while barely of age. His daughter, Lucrezia, would become one of the most notorious women in Europe. But that is a story for later. For now, Rodrigo was rising. He built alliances, not just with cardinals, but with bankers, princes, mercenaries. He gave gifts lavishly. He remembered birthdays. He visited the sick. He kissed hands and charmed mothers. And all the while, he watched the throne of St. Peter, waiting, measuring, planning. He knew that one day the papacy would come open again, and when it did, he would not be outmaneuvered. He had already begun weaving his web. Whisper by whisper, favor by favor, coin by coin, Rodrigo Borgia, the boy from Zativa, was no longer just a cardinal. He was a king in waiting. And the church had no idea what was coming. To understand the man Rodrigo Borgia would become, you must first understand what it meant to be a cardinal in Renaissance Rome. It was not a solemn office of spiritual retreat, not a life of quiet devotion, penance, or modesty. No, in the late 15th century, to be a cardinal was to be a prince in red robes, a prince with no crown, yet more power than kings. And Rodrigo Borgia, he didn't just understand this role, he embodied it. Imagine him now, tall, broad-shouldered, his eyes dark and calculating, not the gaunt, sunken cleric of medieval paintings, but full of life, vigor, and appetite. He dressed impeccably, not merely in the required crimson robes, but in fine fabrics, rich silks from the East, Italian brocades stitched with gold threads, and collars that shimmered under candlelight. His garments were never ostentatious, but never forgettable either. People remembered the scent of his perfume, amber and clove. They remembered the way he looked directly into your eyes when he spoke, and the way, even in a crowded hall of clergy, he moved like a man entirely in control of the room's gravity. Rodrigo was not the only cardinal to live richly, but he lived brilliantly. There is a difference. Others gorged. He dined. Others flaunted. He suggested. He understood the art of indulgence, tempered by the illusion of modesty. And in Rome, an illusion was all anyone needed. The Palazzo Borgia, his private residence, was a wonder in itself. Situated near the Vatican, it was both fortress and theater. Behind its high stone walls were lush gardens, not wild, but manicured to perfection. Oranges grew heavy on the branches in spring. Roses were trained to climb trellises that arched like cathedral windows. At night, torches lined the marble paths, casting long shadows through the ivy. Inside, the palazzo glowed. Tapestries from Flanders hung in the corridors, depicting scenes of saints and wars, some carefully chosen to reflect his family's supposed divine roots. Books, hundreds of them, lined shelves in languages only a scholar could read. A grand hall hosted dinners where cardinals, envoys, merchants, and artists all sat elbow to elbow, each one wondering how they'd earned the invitation. He hired musicians from Florence, poets from Naples, cookware from Milan. It wasn't just about living well. It was about crafting a world that others wanted to belong to. A world where Rodrigo Borgia was the axis around which opportunity spun. Now, let's speak plainly. The church preached chastity, but Rodrigo practiced reality. His private life was an open secret, a carefully kept scandal, hidden in full view. Vanessa de Catene was not a passing affair. She was his companion for nearly 2 decades, and their 4 children were not disowned. They were celebrated. In official documents, they were listed as his nephews, but everyone knew, even the Pope, and yet no one moved against him. Because Rodrigo was useful. To his allies, he was generous. To his enemies, he was dangerous. And to Rome, he was indispensable. He funded chapels, donated to hospitals, sponsored artists. He did just enough good to keep the gossip buried under gold. At his banquets, there was laughter, wine from Greece, capons stuffed with figs, musicians playing madrigals, while cardinals exchanged favors under the table. Not all the guests were men. Rodrigo was known for hosting women at his feasts. Noble women, courtesans, actresses. Their presence caused whispers, but the invitations kept coming. It was said that the Pope's men turned a blind eye, that as long as Rodrigo kept the gears of church diplomacy turning, no one would question what happened after midnight. And what did happen? Well, that depends on who you ask. Some said his garden pavilion was a place of poetry and philosophy, where Latin verses were recited by candlelight. Others claimed it was a harem, where masked dancers entertained the cardinal and his guests until the first light of dawn crept through the lace-covered windows. What's the truth? Probably both. But indulgence alone doesn't build power. Rodrigo was more than a libertine. He was a master strategist. Every gift he gave, every debt he forgave, every seat he offered at his table, it all served a purpose. He mapped Rome like a chessboard, and he played his pieces with elegance. He befriended the bankers. He made peace with the warring families. He knew when to flatter a rival's vanity and when to remind them of their past sins. He wasn't above blackmail, but he rarely needed it. Charm is cheaper than threats, and Rodrigo's charm was a currency more stable than any Florentine coin. He rose, slowly but surely, through the ranks of the Curia, but never too quickly. He waited, always waited. Patience was his most underrated weapon. While other cardinals squabbled over scraps of authority, Rodrigo amassed loyalty. He wrote letters late into the night, always in his own hand. He sent gifts on name days. He visited the sick children of powerful men. He remembered the name of every guard who opened his door. This was not performance. This was engineering, the quiet laying of bricks, for a throne he intended to sit on, not as a cardinal, not as an advisor, but as Pope. And yet, he never seemed in a rush. He made time for pleasure, for poetry, for opera, for feasts that turned into salons, that turned into whispered rendezvous. He did not separate his sins from his service. He blended them so thoroughly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. He became a myth before he ever touched the papal crown. The man who lived like an emperor, laughed like a lover, and ruled like a ghost, always just outside the reach of scandal. And still, he waited. The Pope would die someday. That was inevitable, and when he did, Rodrigo knew he would be ready. Not because he deserved it, not because he was chosen, but because he had built it. Brick by brick, favor by favor, sinner by sinner. Rome was a city of facades, and Rodrigo Borgia had built the most beautiful one of all. Desire is a strange thing in Rome. It's never just about lust, never simply about hunger. Here, desire is cloaked in incense. It wears red silk, it speaks in Latin, and dines by moonlight. And it is always, always tied to power. Rodrigo Borgia understood this better than anyone, because he didn't just want the papacy. He desired it, not in the abstract way that other cardinals did, not because it meant access to vaults or titles or deference, but because the papacy was the final piece in a world he had spent decades designing. To Rodrigo, being pope was not the end of the game. It was the moment the game became real. By the 1480s, Rodrigo had positioned himself brilliantly. He had outlived several popes. He had built alliances with some of the most dangerous families in Italy, the Orsini, the Sforza, the Medici. He had lands, soldiers, bankers who owed him favors, cardinals who owed him their positions, mistresses who owed him their secrets. But what made him truly untouchable was not wealth or even blackmail. It was his gift for understanding how people's desires were never what they claimed. A bishop might ask for a new post, but what he truly wanted was to be envied by his brother. A nobleman might ask for church favor, but what he craved was legitimacy for his bastard child. A queen might send a letter of flattery, but what she wanted was a spy inside the Vatican. Rodrigo read them all. Not the letters, the people behind them. He was a kind of spiritual illusionist, not deceiving the eye, but seducing the soul. He also understood Rome's dirtiest truth, that behind every saint was a sinner with better connections. The papacy had long since stopped being a position of spiritual leadership. It was a throne, a political fortress, a crown wrapped in scripture, and to gain it, one had to do far more than pray. One had to deal. And Rodrigo was the master of the deal. He began planting seeds. Not openly, not yet, but subtly. He began helping rival cardinals settle their feuds, not out of kindness, but to hold both their leashes later. He began funding churches and hospitals, not because he was pious, but because it made his name holy in the mouths of the masses. He even sent food to convents during times of famine. Small gestures, but ones that made priests in every province whisper his name with warmth. He was building something no bribe could buy, a reputation for mercy. But even as he plotted his ascent, his appetites never waned. Desire, remember, doesn't sleep. It merely dresses in new robes. He continued to entertain, continued to charm, continued to father children, including some born from newer mistresses. After Venosa's light had faded from his heart, there were whispers of secret villas in the countryside, of masked women arriving at dusk and leaving before dawn, of children being raised in quiet luxury, their names carefully absent from public records. He was not ashamed. He was simply strategic. The church, ever complicit in its own hypocrisy, ignored what it could not afford to confront. Rodrigo's parties became legendary, not because they were wild, though some were, but because the right people always showed up. Ambassadors, bankers, generals, bishops, and occasionally his enemies. Because Rodrigo had a way of making even his opponents feel that if they stayed close enough, they might be spared the worst of his ambition. But ambition, like desire, has a shape, and Rodrigo was carving his own. He began collecting secrets. He paid the scribes who worked inside the curia. He bribed guards at the Vatican gates. He made friends with cooks, with confessors, with the lowliest servants who were invisible in the rooms where power whispered. He didn't need to guess what his rivals wanted. He already knew. He kept these secrets folded in his mind, like letters in a locked drawer. And every so often, he'd let one slip, just enough to remind the other cardinals that the man in red silk, smiling across the banquet table, was dangerous, but never cruel. That was his brilliance. Rodrigo Borgia did not rule with terror. He ruled with confidence. A confidence so steady, so unbothered, that even his sins looked like strategy. And then, in the year 1492, the stars began to move. Pope Innocent VIII was dying. He had been weak, ineffectual, a man who had spent more than he could raise, and left the papacy drowning in both scandal and debt. As he lay in bed, barely breathing, the College of Cardinals began preparing for war, because the next conclave would not be a spiritual election. It would be a battlefield. And Rodrigo, he was already sharpening his blades. In the summer of 1492, Rome held its breath. Pope Innocent VIII, a man whose reign had left the papal coffers gasping and the cardinals at each other's throats, was finally dying. He had long since ceased to rule. His physicians, at one point, had tried transfusing blood from 3 young boys into the dying pope, a grotesque experiment that killed all 3 of them and did nothing to save him. As his body withered, so did the illusion of papal stability. And so, while the Holy Father lay in his velvet-draped bed, cardinals began sharpening their pens, counting their coin, and preparing for one of the most brazen papal elections in church history, an election not of prayer, but of purchase. And Rodrigo Borgia was ready. He had been ready for decades. You must understand something about these papal conclaves. They were never purely about theology. They were war rooms. Each cardinal entered the Sistine Chapel, not as a man of God, but as a representative of a faction, of a kingdom, of a banking family, of a promise whispered years ago, and finally being cashed in. Rodrigo, of course, understood this better than anyone. He had spent years stockpiling favors, and now it was time to spend them. He summoned messengers, met discreetly with envoys. He didn't just bribe, he negotiated. He offered bishoprics to one man's nephew, promised another the governorship of a papal city. To a third, he gifted a small fortune in florins, delivered in silk sacks by servants who never made eye contact. But he did it quietly. Other cardinals were blatant. They shouted their offers across the dining tables of their palazzos. Rodrigo, on the other hand, sent fine Spanish wine to a rival's house, and inside the crate a scroll with 4 names already signed in support. He understood that the illusion of inevitability was more powerful than persuasion. Make it look like the race is already won, and people will run to be on the winning side. One of the most crucial pieces he secured was the support of Ascanio Sforza, a man of ambition, appetite, and a last name that opened doors in every city of Italy. Rodrigo promised him the vice-chancellorship of the Holy See, essentially the second highest administrative post in the Vatican, a prize worth more than gold. Sforza accepted, and with him came others. Like dominoes, Rodrigo had played it perfectly. But even he knew this would not be clean, because his name was already poisoned in many circles. There were cardinals who despised him, men who saw him not as a servant of God, but as a Spanish libertine with too many children and too few morals. And so the days leading up to the conclave were thick with smoke, the smoke of burning secrets, of hasty alliances, of silent threats passed behind folded hands. On August 6, 1492, the cardinals entered conclave, locked inside the Vatican, sealed from the world. Dozens of men in crimson robes, each praying with one eye open. The voting began. Ballots written by hand, folded, deposited into a chalice upon the altar. No candidate won a majority the first day. or the second, but Rodrigo was close. Whispers turned to tension, and then, on the dawn of August 11th, the final votes came in. Rodrigo Borgia was elected Pope. He took the name Alexander VI. In honor of Alexander the Great, they said, though few doubted which version of greatness he aspired to. The doors of the conclave opened, the smoke from the chimney rose white, and outside, Rome trembled, because the man who now sat on the throne of St. Peter was not a shepherd, he was a tactician, and he had just bought the church. His coronation was nothing short of imperial. The streets were strewn with rose petals. Trumpeters played from balconies. Children in white robes sang hymns as the papal procession wound through the city. Alexander VI sat atop a gilded throne, carried on the shoulders of 12 strong men. He wore robes of pure gold thread, a tiara crusted with jewels, and a smile that barely concealed the fire behind his eyes. The people cheered. Of course they did. They always do. But behind those cheers, there was unease, because everyone in Rome, from street beggar to senator, knew what had just happened. The holiest office in Christendom had gone to the highest bidder. And Rodrigo knew that too. He knew that his election came at a cost, not just in gold, but in perception. He would never be seen as holy. So he chose not to pretend. He did not shed his former life. He embraced it. He kept his children close, especially Cesare and Lucrezia. He allowed Vanosa to retain influence. He made no attempt to hide his excesses. In fact, he leaned into them. He didn't just rule Rome. He owned it. He appointed his allies to every major post. He filled the Vatican with servants loyal only to him. He turned the church into a Borgia court, a place where loyalty was rewarded and disobedience quietly ended. And for a while, it worked. Rome flourished with new construction. Pilgrims came. Money flowed. But the price of that throne was never just gold. It was blood. It was scandal. It was the slow erosion of faith, disguised as celebration. And while the world looked to the Vatican for leadership, Alexander VI was already planning his next feast. Rodrigo Borgia had done the unthinkable. He had become Pope, not by divine selection, not by prophetic calling, but by cunning, by wealth, by patience sharpened over decades into something sharper than steel. He now wore the triple tiara. He now held the keys of St. Peter, and with them, he did not unlock heaven. He opened the gates to something else entirely. Because now, it was time to build. Not just a reign, but a dynasty. Most popes, upon coronation, begin with gestures of humility. They kiss the feet of cardinals. They retreat into prayer. They speak of reform, of renewal, of the weight of holy burden. Rodrigo Borgia did none of that. His first act was to elevate his son. Cesare Borgia, barely 20 years old, clever, ruthless, and too beautiful to be trusted, was made a cardinal. Yes, despite being illegitimate, despite being openly known as the Pope's own son. This was not an accident. This was a declaration. Rodrigo wasn't hiding the family anymore. He was crowning them, and that was only the beginning. His other son, Giovanni, was appointed Duke of Gandia, handsome, charming, and loyal. He was the princely shadow to Cesare's knife. And then there was Lucrezia. Oh, Lucrezia, his daughter, barely a teenager, described by ambassadors as luminous, with golden hair and a smile that made men forget their vows. Rodrigo adored her. And in her, he saw potential, not just for love, but for leverage. Her first marriage was arranged almost immediately after Rodrigo's coronation to a nobleman from the Sforza family, a strategic union designed to cement Rodrigo's fragile alliance with Milan. The wedding was lavish. The dowry was enormous. The message was clear. The Pope's daughter was no cloistered virgin. She was a princess, and Rome would treat her accordingly. Behind the scenes, the Vatican itself began to change. The Borgia coat of arms, golden bulls on a crimson field, appeared on palace walls, tapestries, goblets. Appointments to church office now required not just holiness or education, but Borgia approval. Taxes rose. Nephews of enemies were quietly removed. A spy network expanded across the papal states. Priests who reported to Rome, not about sins, but about sentiments. Was the countryside loyal? Which cardinal dined with which ambassador? What rumors stirred in Naples, in Florence, in Venice? Rodrigo wanted to know everything, not because he feared rebellion, but because he believed control was the highest form of worship. At the heart of all this was Cesare, now a cardinal, but one who dressed more like a prince than a priest. He wore armor under his robes, kept a dagger beneath his desk, and despite his crimson vestments, it was whispered that he continued to indulge. Women, boys, both, neither. Cesare was not bound by rules. He was bound only by results. And Rodrigo loved him for that. He saw in Cesare a mirror, not of his own past, but of the future he envisioned. Not a church ruled by scripture, but by blood. There were scandals, of course. How could there not be? The Pope's daughter entertaining guests in her chamber, late into the night. The Pope's son hosting masked feasts with wine that never stopped flowing, and courtesans who sang nothing holy, and yet nothing stuck, because the Borgia machine was efficient. Bribes flowed like water. Threats were whispered in Latin. Confessions were burned. Even those who hated Rodrigo had to admit he got things done. He reorganized papal finances, expanded the fleet, built roads, brokered peace treaties between warring cities, all while orchestrating marriages, deaths, and legacies. As if conducting a symphony only he could hear, he kept Lucrezia close. Too close, some said. Whispers turned into rumors, rumors into songs, songs into scandal. That he visited her chambers too often, that their love was not fatherly. Nothing was proven, but in a city like Rome, truth was never required, only plausibility. To protect her image, Rodrigo began planning her next marriage. Another alliance, another dowry, another pawn moved across the board. But Lucrezia was not a pawn. Not really. She learned quickly. She watched carefully. And in the years to come, she would prove just as cunning as the men who tried to use her. But for now, she remained the Pope's daughter. Wrapped in lace and secrets, by 1497, the Borgia dynasty reached its peak. The family controlled armies, lands, fortunes. They were feared, admired, hated. Rodrigo's enemies called him the Spanish Pope, a foreigner, a heretic, a hedonist. But none could remove him, because none could match his grip. And then, suddenly, the dynasty began to crack. It began with Giovanni. One night in June, the Duke of Gandia disappeared. His horse was found near the Tiber River, saddlebags cut open, blood on the saddle. Days later, his body was pulled from the water, stabbed, stripped, his throat slit cleanly. Rodrigo was devastated. He locked himself in his chambers, refused food, refused to speak. He wept. The man who had manipulated kings collapsed like a grieving father. For a while, the Vatican stood still, but only for a while, because soon after, Cesare began to change. He resigned from the cardinalate, something almost unheard of, and was given command of the papal armies, and thus began his bloody campaign across Italy. But that is a story for another night. As for Rodrigo, he would rule until 1503. 11 years on the throne, 11 years of indulgence, of schemes, of brilliance and betrayal. He would die, not by sword, but by fever, or perhaps by poison. History disagrees, but what cannot be doubted is the dynasty he left behind. The church would try to forget, historians would try to reframe, but the truth remains. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, did not save souls. He built a family empire and ruled the Vatican like a man who had never feared God to begin with. She was born under silk. not just swaddled in it, but surrounded by it. The walls of her nursery were hung with tapestries. The windows faced courtyards where lemon trees blossomed year-round, and the floor beneath her cradle was polished marble, imported from quarries touched only by the hands of popes and kings. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia. She was born in April of 1480, in the city of Subiaco, not far from Rome, but a world away from simplicity. She was the daughter of a cardinal, a powerful man, a man whose robes were crimson, not just with dye, but with ambition. Rodrigo Borgia, her father, would one day become Pope Alexander VI, but even before that holy crown settled upon his brow, he was a man of indulgence and intrigue. And Lucrezia, she was his golden thread, his most delicate weapon, but she didn't know that yet. Not as a girl, not when her only thoughts were of dolls and gowns and the sunlit hallways of the Borgia Palazzo. She was beautiful, even her enemies admitted it. Hair the color of ripe wheat, eyes that seemed to change, sometimes green, sometimes blue, depending on the light and the mood. A face that painters described as angelic, though angels in those days were often armed. But it wasn't just her looks. From an early age, Lucrezia spoke multiple languages. She could recite poetry, sing, play instruments, and more importantly, she could listen. She was raised not only in palaces, but in the art of performance, because in the Borgia household, every room was a stage, every dinner a negotiation, every smile a mask, and every silence a statement. She watched her father hold court with kings and bishops. She watched her brother Cesare speak 2 sentences and turn a man into an ally or an enemy. She learned, early on, that to be a woman in this world meant being 2 women at once. The one people see, and the one who survives. She had tutors, yes, and maids and gowns and playmates, but she also had watchers, chaperones who were less about protection and more about control. She could not run wild in the city like a peasant child. She could not choose her friends freely, and she could not ever speak ill of her father, because Rodrigo was not a soft man. He adored her, but it was a possessive kind of adoration. She was his reflection, his leverage, a daughter, yes, but also a bargaining chip. From the moment she could walk, she was being measured, weighed, prepared for marriage. Not for love, never for love, but for gain. The Vatican was not blind to her. As her father rose in power, so too did Lucrezia's value rise like incense in a chapel. Ambassadors wrote back to their courts about her. Dukes asked for portraits. Families with titles but no fortunes began sending subtle inquiries. She was 15 when the first contract was signed. 15, barely old enough to understand betrayal, but already dressed in brocade and paraded through Rome as the Pope's daughter. His living, breathing signature on an alliance carved in gold. She would be married to Giovanni Sforza, a powerful noble from Milan's ruling dynasty. The wedding was lavish, the gifts absurd, the food imported from as far as Constantinople. But Lucrezia just smiled, the way she'd been taught, a smile that would become legend, a smile that would one day be accused of hiding poison, of seducing popes and princes, of shattering kingdoms with a glance. But that day, that first marriage day, she was just a girl, standing in a chapel, next to a man twice her age, with trembling fingers, and no idea what came next. She had begun life in a palace, but she was raised in a theater, and the first act was over. Now the play would begin. A play written by powerful men, staged by liars, and watched by the world. But Lucrezia would not just act in it. In time, she would rewrite it. Rome had not yet warmed to spring when the bans were posted. In bold Latin script pinned to cathedral doors, echoed from pulpits, whispered in markets, the city learned that Lucrezia Borgia, Filia Pontificis, would wed Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro and Gradara. She was barely 16. He was 26. a professional soldier from a family famous for trading steel and promises in equal measure. To the crowds who gathered along the Tiber, the match looked simple. North marries South. Lombard, iron clasps Roman gold. Peace is purchased one embroidered veil at a time. But no Borgia bargain was ever simple. Inside the Vatican, Rodrigo's map of alliances resembled a spider's web. Every strand led back to him. Milan's Duke, Ludovico il Moro Sforza, coveted papal favor to guard against French ambition. Rodrigo coveted Ludovico's armies and the silver mines that paid for them, so he offered Lucrezia, a coin made of living flesh, stamped with an angel's face and a father's seal. The wedding day, June 12, 1493, rose beneath a sky the color of white marble. Lucrezia's procession began at the Palazzo Borgia. Silken banners hung from every balcony, crimson fields, twin gold bulls, the papal keys stitched in bright thread. Trumpeters in Spanish liveries led the way, their notes scattering pigeons from terracotta roofs. Behind them, 20 maidens in pale blue carried braccioli, long brocade sleeves stuffed with scented herbs to perfume the humid streets. And then, Lucrezia. Her gown shimmered like moonlight caught in water. Layers of icy damask, seed pearls stitched into 1,000 tiny crosses. Around her waist, a girdle of spun gold. At her neck, a rope of milky Baroque pearls, each the size of a sparrow's egg, each a silent treaty. Over one shoulder lay a length of cloth of gold so heavy. 2 pages bore its train. Witnesses swore her face seemed unreal, an illumination cut from a missal, cheeks brushed with rose, eyelids dusted in ground lapis, lips a cautious line of carmine, but the careful observer might have noticed her fingers, tight on the pomander she held, knuckles bone white beneath kidskin gloves, or the way her eyes rarely met the cheering crowds. Even diamonds weigh something when they're sewn to your future. At Santa Maria del Popolo, the church smelled of wet stone and crushed lilies. Cardinals in scarlet lined the nave like a living colonnade. Ambassadors elbowed for vantage. Merchants craned to glimpse the Pope's fabled daughter. Giovanni waited at the high altar. He wore armor under a robe of black velvet. Insurance, perhaps, against assassins or against his own doubt. A narrow face, clever eyes, a trimmed beard hiding a nervous jaw. Condottieri smile with their swords. And Giovanni had left his outside the church. As Lucrezia approached, choir boys scattered rose petals in her path, until the marble floor looked wounded. Vows were spoken. A cloth was draped across clasped hands. A papal legate declared the union indissoluble save by death, or, unspoken, by Rodrigo's signature. Outside, cannons boomed from Castel Sant'Angelo. Inside, the bride's veil trembled like a captive dove in a storm it did not understand. 1 month later, Lucrezia left Rome in a gilded carriage, bound for Pesaro, Giovanni's coastal stronghold. The journey took 9 days. 9 days of jolting roads, taverns that stank of wood smoke and male laughter, priests blessing every mile for luck. She arrived at dusk. Pesaro's citadel rose from the sea like a blunt fist, walls stained by salt, watchtowers crowned with rusted catapults. Inside, corridors smelled of iron and fish. Her apartments overlooked the harbor, ugly ships at anchor, gulls screaming over heaps of nets, tar smoking in cauldrons. Gone were the citrus gardens of Rome, the poets, the perfumed halls. In Pesaro, conversation tasted of gunpowder and unpaid taxes. Giovanni spent weeks inspecting fortifications, drinking with mercenaries, riding out to skirmishes that never seemed to end. Lucrezia wrote letters on cream-colored vellum, each page heavy with illustrated borders of violets and golden bulls. Most began, Carissimo Padre. She described the sea, the loneliness, the way Giovanni's mother watched her, as though expecting a miracle or a confession. She did not describe Giovanni's absence from her bed, the chill that crept down stone passages at night, the servants' gossip about a husband more interested in quarreling with cousins than caressing a bride. Weeks stretched into winter. Snow dusted the battlements. Lucrezia's ladies embroidered baptismal linens that remained stubbornly unused. Courtiers whispered that the marriage was cursed, or worse, untouched. While Pesaro slept, Italy convulsed. In 1494, Charles VIII of France marched across the Alps, claiming Naples by right of Angevin blood. Milan, terrified, invited him. Pope Alexander, equally terrified, plotted to stop him. The Sforza alliance, once vital, became ballast, dragging the papacy toward French cannons. Rodrigo needed new friends. Spain, the Kingdom of Naples, rising powers who viewed Milan as a rival. Giovanni Sforza, once a convenient son-in-law, was now a liability. In Rome, counselors whispered, annul the match, make a new one. Lucrezia is young, her womb still unbound. Let politics be her dowry anew. And so letters flew south on exhausted couriers. Instructions were inked in papal chambers by candlelight. Secure testimony, collect rumors, prepare a tribunal. The Pope's signature, red as spilled wine, set the machinery grinding. February 1497, a cloaked litter rolled through Rome before dawn, curtains drawn tight. Inside sat Lucrezia, eyes red, lips silent. She was delivered to the convent of San Sisto on the Aventine, a sanctuary or a prison, no one could decide. There she waited. Days melted into prayers. Windows looked onto cloister gardens where cypress trees stood like mute confessors. The abbess reported that the young lady wept often, but never complained. She spent hours in the scriptorium, copying psalms, in a hand so fine the ink looked woven. Outside the walls, a legal fiction unfolded. Papal lawyers argued the marriage had never been consummated. Giovanni was impotens frigidus, impotent and cold. Midwives testified. Physicians nodded gravely, a grotesque public charade, proving a man unable so the Pope might be absolved. Giovanni, incensed, fled to Mantua. He wrote blistering letters accusing Rodrigo of conspiracy, Cesare of plotting murder, Lucrezia of incest with both father and brother. It is not I who cannot perform, he hissed to ambassadors, but the bride who is already with child by her own blood. Poisonous words, too poisonous to ignore. Yet Giovanni lacked allies strong enough to make them stick. He signed the annulment under threat of excommunication, and perhaps sharper methods. In July, the marriage was declared null ab initio, as if it had never existed. Giovanni surrendered Lucrezia's dowry, slunk back to his dwindling command, and spent the rest of his life cursing the day he met a girl, with hair like sunlight and a father who owned eternity. For 7 months, Lucrezia remained at San Sisto. She fasted, prayed, braided her long hair with pearl pins the sisters said were unbecoming of humility. She spoke rarely, yet when she did her voice carried authority that startled even the abbess. Visitors arrived. Cesare, tall and hawk-eyed, bringing boxes of sugared almonds. Rodrigo's secretary with stacks of letters to sign. A jeweler measuring her fingers for rings not yet designed. Outside the convent, choristers rehearsed for a festival. One dusky evening, their anthem drifted over the walls. A nun later wrote in her diary that she found Lucrezia at the lattice window, listening, expression unreadable. Tears, laughter, no, something deeper, decision, because something had shifted. The girl who entered in whispered disgrace emerged a woman, forged in locked rooms and silent corridors. Loss, humiliation, rumors of unspeakable sin. These might have broken another bride. They refined her, polished her like agate rubbed beneath holy water, until the colors inside began to glow. December 1497, the convent gates swung wide. Lucrezia rode out in a black carriage trimmed with cloth of silver. Behind her fluttered banners bearing not the Sforza serpent but the Borgia bulls once more. Restored, renewed, undefeated, crowds packed the streets. Some jeered incest, others tossed violets, Rome's flower of resilience. Lucrezia inclined her head to neither. The smile on her lips was serene, measured to the pulse of drums that echoed from Castel Sant'Angelo. A heartbeat saying, I am still here. That night, Rodrigo hosted a feast in her honor, ostensibly a welcome home, yet every dish tasted of victory. Peacock glazed in saffron, eels stuffed with dates, sugared pine nuts dyed Borgia yellow. Cesare lifted a goblet of Greek wine. To my sister, the light of our house, may her next marriage be as fortunate as the first was brief. Laughter rippled along the table, like steel unsheathing. Lucrezia's eyes flickered, not with shame, not with gratitude, but with calculation, for she knew even then that another bridal contract was already inked, awaiting only wax and rings. The bride price of politics had risen, and she, reborn, would fetch it. In the quiet afterward, when torches guttered and servants swept the courtyard of trampled petals, Lucrezia stood alone beneath an orange tree in bloom. Snow had dusted its leaves, yet the blossoms persisted, fragile, fragrant, improbable. She plucked one, rolled it between finger and thumb. Perhaps she remembered Pessaro's bitter salt air. Perhaps she thought of Giovanni's stammered vows, of convent prayers echoing like chains. Or perhaps a thought more unsettling. She wondered how many more times she would be uprooted, replanted, made to flower for another man's ambition. The petal slipped from her hand, fluttered to wet marble, and was lost. But the thorn she kept. For the first time, Lucrezia understood the family creed, etched into Borgia blood. Those who cannot be saints must learn to be cunning angels. And in that moment, an angel learned to hide her wings beneath velvet, and to smile over the edge of a silver goblet filled with secrets. Every woman who survives a scandal is labeled one of two things: a widow or a weapon. And in the smoky halls of the Borgia Palazzo, Lucrezia had begun to taste what it meant to be both. She was back in Rome now, freed from the crumbling seaside towers of Pesaro, freed from the man who had called her wife and then cowered in the same breath. Freed, yes, but not untouched. You cannot survive an annulment whispered in every cathedral, nor escape the acid sting of words like incest, whore, witch, without losing something. But Lucrezia, she hadn't lost herself. She had simply changed the shape of her silence. It was the autumn of 1497. Rome was swelling with pilgrims and artists. The Pope's vaults were full, his enemies bruised but quiet, and his daughter, his golden daughter, was once again the city's most eligible bride. But between the whispers of marriage contracts and dowries, Lucrezia was carving out something rare for a Borgia woman. Time. Time to be neither wife nor pawn. Time to breathe, if not freely, then at least cleverly. She took up residence in the Palazzo Santa Maria in Portico, a quiet compound once built for monastic seclusion. Her chambers overlooked orange trees and cloistered gardens. There were books, instruments, fresh paper, and perhaps most precious of all, space. She had her own chapel, her own household, her own hours. And in this stillness, Lucrezia began to step outside her father's shadow, not by rejecting it, but by understanding how to walk in its direction without being burned. Among the items found in Lucrezia's private collection, decades later, hidden in a trunk behind a false panel, were letters, delicate, folded many times, tied in silken ribbon. They were written in Spanish, not Latin, not Italian, and they were signed only tuyo en todo pi, yours in all things. P. Attaciant. The scholar who translated them, centuries later, believed they were penned by Pedro Calderón, a young Spanish courtier in Rome during the late 1490s. He was dashing, well-educated, skilled in poetry, fencing, and flattery, and he had one fatal flaw. He fell in love with the Pope's daughter. The letters were neither obscene nor foolish. They were sweet, melancholic, desperate, in that beautiful way that young men become when they know they cannot touch what they most desire. One reads, "Cood, I see you walking in the garden, and the air itself follows you like a servant. I think I loved you before I was born, and now I live only to catch your glance just once." There is no proof that Lucrezia returned his affections. No letter in her hand survives, if there ever was one, but something about those words, folded and kept, suggests at least a flicker of warmth. And for a woman groomed for alliances, warmth itself was rebellion. But Pedro, alas, was only a shadow in her story. One more man who wanted something more than politics, and who likely died far away, never quite knowing if he was remembered. But Lucrezia remembered. She kept his words. And that, perhaps, says more than any record ever will. While Lucrezia read poetry in the portico, her brother Cesare was preparing for war. In 1498, He did what few men of the cloth had ever done. He resigned his cardinal's hat. Publicly, he claimed it was to better serve his father's interests. Privately, it was the moment he stepped into his true skin, no longer red-robed and restrained. Cesare Borgia emerged as the soldier prince he had always dreamed of becoming. Rodrigo sent him to France, draped in velvet, his boots polished, bearing papal blessings and secret deals. In return, Cesare secured not only military support, but also a bride, Charlotte d'Albret, sister of the King of Navarre. Another alliance, another war brewing, and with Cesare unleashed, the air in Rome shifted. He walked with soldiers now, not clerics. His chamber was never empty. His presence, like a hawk circling too low, kept everyone uneasy, even Lucrezia, because no matter how close their bond, how often they dined together in private, Lucrezia had learned long ago that Cesare's love could turn violent if it sensed betrayal. It is said that Cesare once told a courtier, "I would kill for my sister, and I would kill her if I had to." Was it bluster? A myth? A warning? Lucrezia never said, but she was careful with her words from that day forward. Amid all this, a darker chapter unfolded. Lucrezia's brother Juan, the Duke of Gandia, was found floating in the Tiber, stabbed, stripped, dumped like refuse. He had been Rodrigo's favorite, the golden son, a general with more charm than strategy. His death stunned the papal household. Rodrigo shut himself in for days, refusing food, weeping so loudly that even the guards cried. Lucrezia attended mass in black, fasted, lit candles, but Cesare, he was cold, and rumors, whispers like spider legs in the corridors, began pointing fingers. They said Juan had rivaled Cesare for their father's love, that the two had argued violently in the days before his murder, that the dagger found in Juan's back matched the kind Cesare wore. No charges were ever filed. The Pope never demanded an investigation, but Lucrezia, she never mentioned Juan again in her letters. Not once. That silence was its own kind of gravestone. Despite the storms, Lucrezia remained poised. She began holding salons at her palazzo, gatherings of artists, musicians, theologians. She discussed philosophy, spoke Latin with fluency, danced only rarely, but always with grace. Ambassadors reported that she was delightful, educated, impossible to read. One Venetian envoy wrote, "She speaks little, but her eyes say everything. When she enters the room, even the candles seem to flicker differently." Still, she was under surveillance. Rodrigo's spies reported on her guests. Cesare's men shadowed her outings. She was a dove with falcons overhead. And the question loomed again, who would marry her next? Because no matter how poised, no matter how powerful, a woman without a husband in Renaissance Rome was a thread left dangling, dangerous to those holding the loom. In early 1498, a proposal arrived. Alfonso of Aragon, Duke of Biscay, half-brother to the King of Naples, young, handsome, politically ideal. He arrived in Rome wearing sea-blue silks, a knight's bearing, a poet's tongue, and for a brief moment, Rome believed Lucrezia might find peace, that perhaps this time she would be allowed a marriage that was not a trap. The wedding was discreet but joyful. Lucrezia, now 18, wore a gown of soft ivory. Alfonso kissed her hand in public, called her Mia Stella del Mattino, my morning star. And when she bore him a son, Rodrigo, in 1499, even the Pope wept with joy. For a moment, the Borgia house seemed blessed. But in Rome, moments are always brief, especially when power shifts, especially when Cesare Borgia decides you've outlived your use. But that is a story for the next act. Every tale, like Lucrezia Borgia's, ends one of two ways in the minds of most: a tragic fall or a redemptive rise. But Lucrezia's ending was neither. It was a quiet defiance, a slow unfurling, a woman refusing to become the monster history had already decided she was. Because even legends must one day live ordinary days. And in the last act of her story, Lucrezia became something the world never expected her to be: respected. After the storm of her second marriage and the brutal murder of her husband Alfonso of Aragon, by Caesare's order most agreed, Lucrezia spent nearly a year in mourning. Mourning a man she may have loved, mourning a freedom she never had, and perhaps mourning the girl she had once been. But Rodrigo Borgia was still Pope, and the game of alliances never sleeps. So a third marriage was arranged. This time, it was Alfonso d'Este, eldest son of the Duke of Ferrara. Ferrara, refined, northern, proud. A city-state not known for welcoming scandal. And the Este family, they did not want Lucrezia. They saw her as spoiled, contaminated, too many husbands, too many rumors, too Borgia. But Rodrigo offered 200,000 ducats, jewels, titles, troops. And so, reluctantly, they agreed. The contract was signed in 1501. Lucrezia packed her trunks, and once again, she became a bride. The journey north was cold. Snow dusted the hills. Icicles clung to balconies like teeth. When she arrived in Ferrara, crowds gathered in silence. Some jeered, some gawked. Many simply stared. But Lucrezia, now 22, did not flinch. She descended from her carriage, wearing a gown of black velvet, edged with silver thread. No blush, no jewels, just grace. And the Duchess of Ferrara was born. Ferrara was not Rome. There were no torchlit banquets in papal halls, no masked feasts or secret staircases. Here, life moved with restraint. Court was colder, politely suspicious. Lucrezia was treated like fine china, admired, but not yet trusted. The d'Este women eyed her with veiled contempt. Her new husband, Alfonso, spent long days in the arsenal, testing cannons, drilling troops. At night, he rarely came to her. But Lucrezia was patient. She learned the rhythms of Ferrara. She began dressing in Ferrari style, simpler gowns, softer tones. She commissioned altarpieces, hosted poets, brought music into the cold stone halls, and warmed them with her laughter. Slowly, very slowly, she won them over. Not with seduction, but with steadiness. She asked after the servants' families. She paid the debts of convents. She remembered names. She smiled. Not the daggered smile of Rome, but something softer, earned. In time, she began to rule. When Alfonso left to campaign, Lucrezia governed Ferrara in his absence. She sat in council, reviewed taxes, settled disputes. Ambassadors wrote home with surprise. The Duchess speaks wisely. She listens longer than any man at court. She transformed Ferrara into a cultural capital. Writers, painters, musicians flocked to her court. She patronized the great poet Ludovico Ariosto, whose Orlando Furioso would become one of Italy's greatest epics. She supported monasteries. She financed public works. She began collecting rare books, binding them in white leather with her personal seal. And above all, she bore children. Many. Some died, as children often did, but others survived. One son, Ercole, would rule Ferrara after her. Another, Ippolito, would become a cardinal. She loved them fiercely. She wrote to them often, not with orders, but with affection. And in those letters, the woman who history painted as a seductress revealed herself as a mother who once whispered lullabies in Latin beneath tapestries embroidered with lions and lilies. In her final years, Lucrezia changed again. After her father died in 1503 and Cesare fell from power, the Borgia star began to fade. But Lucrezia rose. She withdrew from court banquets. She embraced religion, not as penance, but as peace. She supported nuns, funded hospitals, walked barefoot on certain feast days, her fine gowns trailing behind her like shadows of her past. And yet, she was not cloistered. She still governed. She still smiled. But now, it was a quieter smile. The smile of a woman, who had survived what others had not. She died in 1519 at the age of 39, exhausted from childbirth. The baby did not survive. The city mourned, not in gossip, not in scandal, but in silence. She was buried in the convent of Corpus Domini. No crown, no golden bowls, just a slab of stone and a single inscription: Lucrezia Borgia, daughter of Pope Alexander VI, wife of Alfonso d'Este, mother of Urkel, may she rest in peace. They tried to bury her beneath stories. They tried to paint her in poison, to lace her smile with seduction, to reduce her into a headline before headlines even existed. But Lucrezia refused. She survived Rome. She outlasted her father's shadow. She ruled with dignity. She loved, she lost, and she lived. Not as a myth, not as a monster, but as a woman who learned how to hold power with one hand while soothing the world with the other. In the end, she gave more to the world than it ever gave her, and all she asked was to be remembered truthfully, not as a saint, not as a sinner, just as herself. Every child of Rodrigo Borgia was born into a story already halfway written. But for Cesare, the eldest son, the story was more than just inheritance. It was a trap lined with velvet. From his first breath, Cesare Borgia was marked, not by destiny, but by design. His father had plans, sharp, meticulous, long-reaching plans, and Cesare was to be a bishop before he was a man, a cardinal before he knew the weight of sin, and a puppet of heaven before he ever held a sword. Because that was how power worked in the 15th century. Your future was not chosen by God, but by your father's ability to buy, charm, and threaten in the right rooms. And Rodrigo? Rodrigo had perfected all three. Cesare was born in 1475, likely in Rome or nearby. His mother was Vannozza de Catane, Rodrigo's longtime mistress, a noblewoman, but not of royal standing. Cesare, like his siblings, was illegitimate, but illegitimacy, in Rodrigo's world, was no obstacle. Merely a formality to be erased with enough favors and paper seals. From childhood, Cesare was groomed for the church, not because he was pious, not because he showed signs of devotion, but because Rodrigo knew that the church wasn't built on saints anymore. It was built on family. Lucrezia would marry into power. Giovanni would command armies. But Cesare would wear crimson, not the crimson of blood, not yet, but of a cardinal's robes. He was educated in the finest schools, sent to the University of Perugia, then to Pisa, to study canon law. He spoke Latin fluently, read Greek, could debate Aquinas in the morning, and recite Virgil by evening. But he was also restless. Even as a boy, he preferred riding to reading, preferred fencing drills to liturgy, and once, after beating a tutor with a candlestick for mispronouncing his name, he calmly apologized, then asked for a sword lesson. Cesare was not cruel, not yet, but he was calculated. A boy who smiled after silence, a boy who could charm a room, then burn the letters left on the table. In 1493, at the age of 19, Cesare Borgia was made a cardinal by his father, now Pope Alexander VI. The appointment caused outrage, not just because Cesare was young, not just because he was the Pope's son, but because everyone knew Cesare had no interest in salvation. He treated the position like a mask. Wore the robes, yes. Attended Mass, yes. But behind closed doors, he gambled. He took lovers. He brawled with guards. He hosted banquets where the wine never stopped flowing, and the servants pretended not to hear what echoed down the marble halls. There are accounts of Cesare arriving late to church council, his vestments hastily thrown over riding leathers, the smell of sweat and cloves still clinging to his sleeves. And yet, no one could remove him, because the Pope would not allow it. Because Cesare, even then, was useful. He ran errands for his father, negotiated bribes, delivered threats. He was more courier than cleric, and more wolf than either. Ambassadors began calling him Il Cardinale delle Armi, the cardinal of weapons. They joked that his crozier was hollow and filled with daggers. And Cesare? He let them whisper. Because he was waiting. Because inside his crimson robes, beneath his jeweled cross, there beat the heart of a general, still chained by holy oaths. But not for much longer. The robe was always too tight, the smile too still, the cross that hung around his neck too heavy with expectation. Cesare Borgia was a cardinal in title only. Behind the cassock was armor, behind the scripture steel. He was born with a sword in his spirit, and no matter how finely stitched the fabric of his crimson vestments, the blade inside him kept cutting through, and one day he stopped pretending otherwise, because a mask worn too long doesn't just slip, it shatters. On a quiet June night in 1497, Rome lost its golden prince, Giovanni Borgia, Duke of Gandia, Rodrigo's favorite son, a soldier, a charmer, a man who laughed loudly and loved freely. He vanished after a feast. His horse was found near the banks of the Tiber, saddle stained with blood. His body was pulled from the river days later. Stab wounds in the chest, the throat cleanly slit, no ring on his finger, no purse at his waist. Rome was horrified. The Pope was inconsolable. Rodrigo locked himself in his chamber, refused to eat, tore his robes, wept in public. For a week, the Vatican fell into mourning, and Cesare said nothing. He stood at the funeral, a still shadow in red. He watched his father sob. He offered no comfort, no tears, only silence. And so the whispers began, that Giovanni had become too ambitious, that he had crossed a line, that he had drawn the jealousy of a brother who wore a cross but desired a crown. One guard claimed Cesare had left the Vatican that night with his face covered and his steps too light. A servant reported a dagger missing from his personal armory. Even Lucrezia, it is said, refused to look Cesare in the eyes for months. There was no investigation, no trial. The Pope ordered a search, then suddenly called it off, and just like that, the murder was sealed in rumor, a secret embalmed in silk. Giovanni was buried, and Cesare, he smiled, not widely, not cruelly, just enough to let Rome know that one less Borgia now stood between him and his real destiny. Even before Giovanni's death, Cesare had begun to change. He attended fewer religious events. He stopped offering Mass. He was rarely seen in clerical garments, favoring velvet tunics, black gloves, polished boots. He walked through the Vatican halls like a prince trapped in the wrong story. People noticed. Ambassadors wrote letters to their kings. Cesare Borgia is no priest. He longs for the battlefield. There were rumors of secret fencing schools, of midnight duels in papal gardens, of a pet lion he kept chained in his courtyard, fed only on live deer. There were women, many. One noblewoman claimed he visited her in a black mask and left a purse of silver on the pillow. A courtesan said he prayed with her, then asked her to bite his shoulder until he bled. These stories sound exaggerated, too theatrical. And yet, this was Cesare's world. He didn't hide who he was. He performed it. He was a cardinal who moved like a soldier, a churchman with a dagger sewn into his cuffs, a Borgia. And then, in 1498, he made his move. In an unprecedented decision, Cesare Borgia resigned the cardinalate. Popes did not let sons resign holy office. It was too public, too scandalous, too risky, but Rodrigo allowed it. Why? Because the Borgia dream had shifted. Lucrezia had been disgraced. Giovanni was dead. And Cesare, the one son who could still carry the name into legend, needed a new path. Rodrigo wrote to the French court, to King Louis XII. He proposed an alliance. Cesare would travel to France, support Louis's claim to Naples, and in return, the king would grant him a dukedom, a bride, an army. And so, in late 1498, Cesare boarded a gilded barge, crossed the Alps, and left Rome behind. When he returned months later, he was no longer a cardinal. He was Duke of Valentino, wearing black armor, a new ring on his finger, and a sword on his hip. They called him now Il Valentino. Cesare had cast off the robes, and in doing so, he became something far more dangerous, a Borgia without limits. When Cesare returned to the Vatican, Rome stood still. No one greeted him with holy titles. No cardinals embraced him, but all watched. He walked into the apostolic palace like a returning general, rode through the city with gold-plated armor, and behind him marched French troops. He had done what no other papal son had ever done. He had turned the papacy into a military dynasty, and Rome, divided between admiration and terror, waited to see what this cardinal-turned-commander would do next. Cesare had one mission: to carve a kingdom of his own. With papal blessing, he was granted command of Vatican forces, his target the lawless territories of Romagna, a patchwork of cities ruled by petty tyrants, famously rebellious, famously rich. He would march north. He would take what others had failed to hold. And so began one of the most brutal military campaigns in the history of Renaissance Italy. But that tale is for the next chapter, because Cesare Borgia, once the Church's cardinal, was now Rome's most dangerous prince, and he had not yet drawn blood enough. Power, in the time of Cesare Borgia, was not won with faith. Not even with blood. It was won with paper. Parchment soaked in ink and sealed in wax, and sometimes with a bride. By 1499, Cesare had shed his cardinal's robes, and with them the last illusion of piety. He no longer bowed at altars. He no longer recited creeds. He spoke now in terms of treaty, title, and terrain. But power, real power, needs more than ambition. It needs a crown to aim for, and allies to hold the door open. So Cesare gambled everything on France. King Louis XII of France was in need of a divorce. He wanted to marry Anne of Brittany, but he was still wed to the daughter of his predecessor, a political bind wrapped in sacred vows. Rodrigo Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, offered a solution. He would grant the annulment, quietly, quickly. In return, he wanted titles for his son, a French duchy, money, and a bride of noble blood. Louis agreed. He saw in Cesare the perfect Roman blade to extend French fingers into Italy, and so Cesare was welcomed at the French court. He arrived not as a papal envoy, but as a duke. His retinue glinting with gold, his demeanor cool as steel. He kissed the king's hand, smiled carefully at the queen, charmed the courtiers, whispered Latin epigrams that made the ladies blush, and the ministers exchange glances. But Cesare was not here to be admired. He was here to claim. On May 10, 1499, Cesare Borgia married Charlotte d'Albret, a French princess of royal blood, sister to the King of Navarre. She was young, pious, soft-spoken, barely 17. The wedding was held in Blois, a snow-dusted affair beneath towering firs, lit by hundreds of candles. The French court came out in pearl-draped sleeves and ermine cloaks. Cesare wore black velvet, a deep crimson sash at his waist, a nod, perhaps, to the blood still binding him to Rome. He did not look at Charlotte much. She was not what he had come for. Her lands, yes. Her connections, certainly. But her smile? That he would not need. After the vows, he kissed her politely, spoke softly in Spanish, and returned to his wine. He stayed in France, just long enough to ensure the marriage was recorded. Then he left. Charlotte never saw him again. She gave birth to a daughter, Louise, whom Cesare never met. And just like that, the princess faded into the footnotes of a rising empire, because Cesare had gotten what he came for. And Italy was waiting. As part of the arrangement, Cesare was given command of French troops, a new army, experienced, disciplined, and brutal. In exchange, he would support France's claim to Milan and Naples, and carve out his own principality from the lands in between. The plan was as ambitious as it was ruthless. He would sweep through Romagna, a region fractured into small, independent cities, each ruled by petty tyrants, minor dukes, and reluctant bishops. He would bring them to heel, not in the name of the church, but in the name of Valentino, because Caesar was no longer fighting for God. He was fighting for himself, and with France behind him, he moved like thunder across the north. Caesar's retinue was legendary. At its core was a man named Micheletto Carella, a Spaniard, rumored to be Cesare's childhood friend and his executioner. Micheletto never smiled, never drank. He wore black armor and carried rope instead of a sword. He was Cesare's whisper in the dark, the hand that ensured silence, the shadow that closed every door. Then there was Vitello Sovitelli, a warlord who loved art but burned towns. Oliverotto da Fermo, who once invited his enemies to dinner and stabbed them between courses. And of course, the Orsini, Rome's old lion family, who grudgingly allied with Cesare for spoils. Together, they swept across central Italy, city by city, Imola, Forlì, Faenza. One by one, they surrendered or fell. Cesare promised peace, then poisoned the wells. He offered mercy, then sent Micheletto at midnight, and still, people admired him, because he built roads after battle, fed the poor with stolen grain, commissioned altars with enemy gold. He understood what every prince must learn. You can be feared so long as you are not hated, and Cesare, for now, walked that line perfectly. Rodrigo, back in Rome, watched his sons rise with pride. He issued bulls declaring Cesare's right to rule the Romagna. He declared each victory not conquest, but restoration of church property. The hypocrisy was laughable, but effective. Even Machiavelli, who would later write The Prince, watched Cesare with fascination. He wrote, "I know of no better example of a man who rose through fortune and arms. He had a father who could make him great, and he used him well." Cesare sent back gifts, silks, reliquaries, bloodied banners, and Rodrigo responded with blessings and more titles. But beneath the pageantry, something darker stirred, because power draws enemies, and Cesare, now bathed in victories, had begun making too many men nervous. In late 1502, in the city of Sinigaglia, Caesar invited several of his most powerful allies, Vitelli, Oliverotto, and the Orsini, to a grand feast. Wine was poured, toasts made, he laughed with them, promised more land, more battles, more gold. Then, as dawn approached, he had them all arrested. Micheletto took Vitelli to the river, strangled him with a silk cord. Oliverotto was killed with his own dagger. The Orsini were hunted down days later. Cesare sent letters to Rome calling it a necessary purification. And just like that, he removed his greatest threats without drawing a sword. The mask was off. The velvet was gone. Cesare Borgia, once cardinal, now duke, stood alone, crowned not by God, but by fear. And Italy, now truly his for the taking. To rule a land is to tame its people. To tame a people, you must first teach them to fear your absence more than your presence. Cesare Borgia understood this. He did not simply conquer cities, he rebuilt them. He didn't just execute enemies, he elevated peasants to fill their place. Because Cesare did not want to rule with brutality alone. He wanted something much rarer, a legacy. And so, in the shadow of war, beneath banners, stitched with both the papal keys and the French fleur-de-lis, Cesare Borgia began building his dream, a Borgia kingdom, carved from the spine of Italy itself. Imola, Forlì, Faenza, Rimini, Urbino. City after city surrendered or fell under Cesare's boot, and with each conquest, he did something most warlords never considered. He governed. In Imola, he lowered taxes. In Forlì, he repaired roads, reopening trade routes once blocked by decades of petty infighting. In Rimini, he publicly punished soldiers for theft. In Faenza, he commissioned fountains and reopened schools. To the common folk, he seemed almost benevolent. To the nobility, he was a storm in silk gloves. He hired local administrators, not foreign ones. A subtle but brilliant move, because loyalty earned at home was stronger than fear imposed from abroad. Even the merchants wrote back to Venice and Florence with cautious optimism. Rome bulsing, but Lormans, the Duke is fair, he is swift, he is dangerous, but he does not lie. Cesara's rule was not gentle, but it was predictable. And in an Italy broken by scheming nobles and corrupt bishops, predictability felt like peace. Cesara's vision was clear: a united Romagna, ruled not as disparate city-states, but as a centralized duchy under his name. He didn't just use muscle, he used law. He created standardized taxes, appointed traveling judges, founded postal routes, and where once chaos reigned, now roads ran smoothly. He minted coins bearing his image, had his own flag flown beside papal banners, issued orders sealed with his personal crest, not Rome's. It was, in every sense, a state within the state, and the Pope, his father Rodrigo, blessed it all. With papal bulls, he legitimized Cesare's holdings. With troops, he suppressed revolts. With indulgences, he silenced the clergy. To the world, Caesar was no longer just a duke. He was becoming a king in waiting. Caesar understood that swords opened doors, but marriages sealed them shut. He arranged weddings for allies, used betrothals like chess pieces. When the Duke of Urbino surrendered, Caesar offered safe passage, then married the duke's niece to one of his commanders. In another city, he pardoned a rebellion, then wed the rebel leader's daughter to a Borgia cousin. He sent letters to Spain, to Florence, to Ferrara, each laced with compliments, veiled threats, and poetic Latin. And if diplomacy failed, there was always Micheletto, always the silk cord at midnight. Niccolò Machiavelli, the Florentine diplomat, was sent to observe Caesar during this time. He stayed for months, shadowing the Duke, sitting in on councils, watching him handle betrayal, theft, governance, and war. And in The Prince, years later, he would write, Relics Fenicitu. Cesare Borgia is the model for what a ruler must be, both lion and fox, strong enough to terrify, clever enough to avoid traps. Machiavelli noted that Cesare was polite, well-spoken, generous in public, and utterly merciless in private. He described Cesare's eyes as quiet and hungry, a man who listened more than he spoke, but when he did speak, you obeyed. The other princes of Italy feared Cesare for his troops, but Machiavelli feared him for his mind. And then, in August of 1503, Pope Alexander VI fell ill. Rodrigo Borgia, Cesare's father, collapsed during a banquet. Some claimed he was poisoned. Others said it was malaria. Whatever the cause, he died after days of sweating, vomiting, and fever. The papal apartments were sealed, the body swollen, blackened, the stink so bad they buried him in haste. Cesare, who had been ill himself, barely survived. But when he awoke, the world had shifted. Because without the Pope, without Rodrigo, Cesare had no anchor. The papal bulls ceased. The cardinals began circling like wolves. The French grew cautious. The Orsini rose again. And Cesare, fevered, weakened, half-mad, watched the kingdom he had built begin to crack. The papal conclave in September 1503 was a battlefield of whispers. Cesare backed Cardinal Piccolomini, hoping to control him from behind the curtain, but Piccolomini died within a month of election. A second conclave convened, and this time, the college chose Giuliano della Rovere, Cesare's fiercest enemy, now crowned Pope Julius II. He declared an end to Borgia rule. He revoked Cesare's titles, ordered his arrest, had his cities taken back by force or decree, and Cesare, weakened, desperate, betrayed by allies and hunted by former friends, was forced to flee Rome. He had been a prince, a king in everything but name, and now he was just a fugitive with a sword. In 1504, Cesare fled to Naples, then to Spain. He begged old allies for help, but his name, once a banner of power, was now a death sentence. Eventually, he was arrested by the Spanish crown and imprisoned in the castle of La Mota. He escaped in 1506, fleeing to Navarre, his wife's homeland. And there, in a final blaze of glory, he offered to serve as a general for King John III of Navarre, fighting a local rebellion. In March 1507, while scaling a fortress wall during a nighttime skirmish, Cesare was ambushed. He fought fiercely, sword against pike, armor splintering, boots slipping in the mud, but alone, surrounded, he was stabbed in the chest. Then again and again, they stripped his corpse, left it in a ditch, naked beneath the stars. He was 31 years old. When Machiavelli heard of Cesare's death, he didn't mourn, he studied. He wrote, Saltaris matrain, he would have been unstoppable. Cesare Borgia had been a cardinal, a duke, a conqueror, a killer, a dreamer. He ruled with elegance and cruelty. He built cities and destroyed legacies, and in his wake, he left something far more dangerous than just memory. He left an idea that a man could rise, not by divine right, but by sheer will. Not through holiness, but through strategy. And though the Vatican scrubbed his name, and his banners were burned, and his coins melted, the ghost of Cesare Borgia still walks the streets of Imola and Urbino, still lingers in the minds of every ruler who dares to ask, what if I took everything and never apologized? Before the gold, before the gowns, before the banquets and the burning books, there was a little boy. He wasn't born into a monastery, but he was wrapped in its silence before he could speak, born into power, but groomed for obedience. Because for the Medici, Rome wasn't just a destination, it was a strategy. The year was 1475. Florence was at its peak, its palaces gilded with patronage, its streets echoing with the voices of painters and philosophers. And at the heart of that world stood the Medici family, bankers to popes, lenders to kings, rulers in all but name, Lorenzo de' Medici. Lorenzo the Magnificent was not just a political force, he was a cultural sun around which all of Florence revolved. And into this solar dynasty was born his second son, Giovanni di Lorenzo de' Medici. He was not raised to inherit power in Florence. That was for his older brother, Piero. No, Giovanni's path was chosen the moment he opened his eyes. He would wear the robes of the church. He would serve God, but in a way that preserved Medici gold and Medici ambition. It was a chess move disguised as a baptism. At age 7, Giovanni was made a cardinal in waiting. Let that sit with you. Before he could write his own name in full, he was being measured for ecclesiastical robes. Before he could grow a beard, he had a place at the future College of Cardinals. The Vatican was not shocked. They understood the game. The Medici had wealth. The church had power. What was a title between friends? At age 13, he was officially elevated to cardinal by Pope Innocent VIII. Too young to vote, too young to ride alone at night, but not too young to hold a red hat and a claim on the soul of Europe. He was sent to Rome, a boy among men, in a palace of serpents, and yet Giovanni thrived. Unlike his more austere contemporaries, young Giovanni was no ascetic. He loved books, yes, but not always the kind approved by the church. He collected manuscripts, rare, illuminated, banned in some corners. He spoke Greek, Latin, and a little Hebrew. He debated theology in the morning and quoted Ovid's erotic poetry by candlelight. He loved velvet robes, gilded slippers, imported spices on roasted game. Even as a cardinal, he enjoyed parties that looked more like feasts in Florence than vigils in Rome. But make no mistake, he was not just a playboy. He was brilliant, clever, educated by the best minds of the Renaissance, and trained from childhood to walk the line between piety and performance. Giovanni de' Medici understood the church, not as a temple, but as a stage, and one day he would be the star. In 1494, the Medici were overthrown in Florence. Giovanni's family was exiled, their palaces looted, their name burned in effigy. He wandered Italy like a ghost in scarlet, respected in the Vatican, but with no home to return to. And in that wandering, he learned two lessons. Trompicus halterax, Trompicus halti times dari. Waited. The Borgia popes rose and fell. Blood stained the cobblestones. One pope poisoned, another imprisoned. Cardinals fled. Enemies plotted. But Giovanni, he stayed, watched, waited. And when Pope Julius II, the warrior pope, finally died in 1513, Giovanni knew his time had come. At age 37, Giovanni entered the conclave to elect a new pope. He did not campaign openly. He smiled. Let others rant about reform. He offered dinner. Let others promise justice. He whispered favors. He kissed rings. He offered pensions. He offered Florentine credit. And after weeks of horse trading, bartered votes, and velvet promises, on March 11, 1513, he emerged as Pope Leo X, the first Medici pope, the second son of Florence. The boy turned cardinal turned exile was now master of the world's most powerful church. And as he stepped into the sunlight on the Vatican balcony, wrapped in white silk, with crowds screaming his name and trumpets blaring from St. Peter's, he is said to have turned to his brother and whispered, "God has given us the papacy. Let us enjoy it." The coronation of a pope is not merely a ritual. It is a theatrical unveiling of power, a pageant of silk and incense, of ancient chants and whispered debts. But Leo X, he didn't just want a coronation. He wanted a coronation remembered for centuries, a Medici triumph with all the pageantry of a Roman emperor, and all the velvet seduction of a Renaissance prince. And Rome, oh Rome gave him the stage. On March 19, 1513, Pope Leo X made his ceremonial entrance into Rome as its newly crowned ruler. The city had not seen a display like this in years. It began at the Castle Sant'Angelo, once the tomb of Hadrian, now a fortress of the papacy. There, a golden tiara was placed gently upon Leo's brow, weighing not just in gold, but in the symbolic burden of Peter's throne. But Leo wore it lightly. He emerged to a city drenched in celebration. The roads were covered in carpets. Balconies were hung with silk. Noble women threw rose petals. Trumpeters blew fanfares from the rooftops. A white horse carried the new pope through the city gates, accompanied by cardinals in scarlet, Swiss guards in gold, and an entourage stretching for nearly a mile. He waved, he smiled, he radiated the grandeur of Florence and the might of Rome, and all of it was choreographed to perfection. That night, the Vatican hosted a banquet so opulent that even seasoned Roman nobles reportedly gasped. Tables were stacked with exotic fruits from Cyprus and Spain. Golden bowls overflowed with sugared almonds and pomegranate seeds. Roasted peacocks were served with their tail feathers reattached, glittering with powdered gold. There were mechanical fountains that sprayed wine, choirs that sang in polyphony from hidden balconies, actors in mythological garb performing scenes from Virgil and Ovid. One long table was carved to resemble the river Tiber, its courses flowing in gentle curves, with golden fish dishes and eels served in spirals like currents. The air was scented with crushed jasmine and citrus, and for dessert, sugar sculptures of biblical scenes crafted by Florentine artists, each more detailed than a painting. Even the goblets were embossed with the Medici crest. This was not just feasting. It was ideological cuisine. The Medici have returned, and Rome is their theater. Leo X was not the type to fast in a cave or sleep on stone floors. He did not believe in pious austerity. To him, pleasure was proof of divine favor. He believed beauty was a language of God, a bridge between the heavenly and the human. He collected art, commissioned manuscripts, and surrounded himself with poets, architects, and scholars. When he walked through the Vatican, he was followed not just by priests, but by musicians, jesters, and mathematicians. He revived the ancient pagan festivals, but Christianized them. He brought back public games, parades, masquerades on the Tiber, theatrical sermons where actors wept as martyrs. He was the Epicurean Pope, offering salvation through splendor, and in every gesture, every gilded gesture, he seemed to say, "This is the kingdom of heaven, and we are already here." Leo adored performance, not just art, the act of performance. He hosted operas in the Vatican courtyard, invited acrobats from Venice, kept actors and playwrights on his personal payroll. There were rumors, whispers that the Pope's affections for certain young performers went beyond patronage, but Rome had seen worse. Rome always saw worse, and Leo knew that distraction was its own kind of control. Let the poor whisper, let the nobles clink glasses and gossip. He gave them all a stage to look at, so they wouldn't see the debts stacking behind the curtain. And besides, was it not fitting for the successor of Peter to be surrounded by beauty? Leo X did not merely inherit the Renaissance. He curated it. He commissioned Raphael to paint frescoes in the Vatican Palace, funded the continuation of St. Peter's Basilica, a project so grand that even emperors paused to admire it. He revived forgotten liturgies, redesigned choir books, insisted that Mass should sound like heaven and look like the Garden of Eden. Marble statues, mosaic floors, painted domes, velvet curtains, and everywhere the Medici crest, subtly tucked into corners, whispering, "This is not just the church, this is Florence made holy." Behind the incense, behind the velvet drapery and the golden chalices, beneath the soaring domes of Raphael's Rome, there was another Vatican, not the holy one, the hidden one, where wine spilled more freely than prayer, where banquets ran longer than Mass, and where salvation could sometimes be bought with a wink and a heavy purse. For Pope Leo X, revelry wasn't sin, it was celebration, a signal to the world that the Church, like Rome itself, was alive and unashamed of its appetites. But as the festivities intensified, the boundaries blurred, and the Vatican, once a temple of devotion, became something closer to a theater of indulgence. Leo X didn't just host banquets. He choreographed them. There were feasts for cardinals, feasts for artists, feasts for ambassadors, feasts to honor saints, and feasts to celebrate victories that had never been won. One Venetian ambassador wrote in a letter home, "The Pope's table groans like an altar of gluttony." Each feast was a fantasia, tables covered in white cloth, bearing roasted swans with crowns of rosemary, jellied fruits molded into miniature basilicas, eel pies shaped like sea monsters, peacock tongues marinated in rosewater and vinegar. At one banquet, an entire miniature city was baked from sugar, complete with walls, towers, and tiny sugar people marching in holy procession. And the guests, they were fed until they could no longer rise. Then dancers entered, then singers, then dwarves in golden tunics balancing trays of candied violets. And at the center of it all, Leo, smiling beneath his tiara, eyes twinkling, a pope holding court like Bacchus. Leo's taste for the exotic didn't stop at cuisine. He filled the Vatican with creatures from across the world. A white elephant, gifted from the King of Portugal, paraded through Rome bearing silken tapestries. Its name was Haino, and Leo adored it, commissioning a special stable, feeding it sweet cakes, even having it blessed by bishops. There were leopards in golden cages, monkeys trained to bow, peacocks that roamed the Vatican gardens and left their droppings on ancient Roman statues. He turned the papal court into a Renaissance Noah's Ark, half spectacle, half diplomacy. It wasn't just decadence, it was message. The world has come to kneel before Peter's throne, and all of it now eats from the Pope's hand. But not all of Leo's spectacles were for foreign eyes. Some were hidden deep in the Vatican halls, behind guarded doors and under painted ceilings. There are whispers of certain nights, of parties that began with scripture readings and ended in masked revelry. One such gathering is still spoken of in hushed tones, the Banquet of the Chestnuts. Though modern historians debate its details, the accounts that survive are intoxicating. According to one chronicler, 100 courtesans were invited to a secret chamber. They danced nude beneath candelabras. Chestnuts were scattered across the floor, and the women were ordered to crawl and collect them, while the Pope and his guests watched and wagered. It sounds like slander, a fever dream penned by a jealous rival. But in Leo's Rome, what was unbelievable was often true. A cardinal once arrived at a formal audience with wine stains on his vestments and a broken lute string in his pocket. Another was seen urinating from a Vatican balcony, singing a Florentine drinking song. No one was punished. No one was shamed, because the mood of the papal court was not piety, but pleasure masquerading as divine right. But all of it, the sugar cities, the leopard cages, the endless feasts, cost something. A lot, in fact. By 1515, just 2 years into his papacy, Leo Lex had spent more than the entire annual income of the Holy See. The Vatican treasury was empty. Florentine bankers were owed hundreds of thousands of florins. Gold reserves had vanished like smoke through a censer. But Leo did not stop. Instead, he invented new ways to raise money. He sold bishoprics. He sold titles. He allowed nobles to buy sacred relics, indulgences, even positions in the curia. One papal official reportedly sold the same cardinalate 3 times to 3 different men and pocketed the difference. Church offices became commodities, and salvation itself began to carry a price tag. The final blow came with indulgences. To fund the continued construction of St. Peter's Basilica, Leo authorized a massive indulgence campaign across Europe. The message was simple: give money to the church and receive a certificate reducing time in purgatory. The more you gave, the more souls you could redeem, even the dead. In Germany, a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel became the face of the operation. As soon as a coin in the coffer rings, he said, a soul from purgatory springs. He set up booths, sent criers through towns, turned absolution into a kind of traveling fair. People lined up, desperate, pouring their life savings into wooden boxes in the hope of saving grandma's soul. And back in Rome, the money flowed into banquet halls and marble domes. It was indulgence, not orgies or elephants, that finally pushed one man too far. In 1517, a monk in Wittenberg named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the door of a church, challenging not just indulgences, but the very heart of papal authority. And the world began to shift. At first, Leo dismissed him, called him a drunken German, expected it would blow over like all scandals did, but it didn't, because what began as a critique became a movement, a wildfire of reform, a reformation. And as the flames spread, people looked back to Rome, to the sugar feasts and the dancing nudes, and they saw not the kingdom of God, but a gilded rot. When the church began to wobble beneath the weight of its own excess, Leo X did not confess. He commissioned. He believed in redemption through beauty. That stone and paint could silence reformers more swiftly than swords. So while the coffers emptied, he summoned the greatest minds of his age and built cathedrals in defiance of doubt. Rome would be remade, not by saints or martyrs, but by artists. And if heaven was slipping from his grasp, Leo would at least leave behind a paradise in marble. His name was Raffaello Sanzio da Urbino. The world knows him as Raphael. He was young, brilliant, and his hands could conjure serenity from wet plaster, the way poets draw tears from ink. Leo adored him. Raphael became the papal painter, architect, confidante, and together they envisioned a Vatican that was not merely sacred, but sublime. Raphael's rooms, the Stanze di Raffaello, became the visual soul of the Renaissance church. Walls burst with biblical scenes, so alive that cardinals paused mid-conversation just to breathe them in. There were angels painted with the softness of breath, philosophers rendered with halos of divine thought, apostles wrapped in robes that shimmered like dawn light over the Tiber. And Leo watched it all with a glint in his eye. "Let Luther write," he said once. "We'll answer him with beauty." Not far from Raphael's murals, another genius climbed scaffolds under moonlight, Michelangelo Buonarroti. Brooding, reclusive, tormented by perfection, he had already painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, a divine thunderclap in fresco, commissioned under Pope Julius II. But Leo wanted more. He wanted Michelangelo to finish what had been started, the crowning jewel of Christian architecture, St. Peter's Basilica. Michelangelo balked, argued he was a sculptor, not an architect. But Leo knew how to woo. He gave him authority, resources, and the freedom to dream. And so, amid the swirling storm of Reformation, Michelangelo began sketching a dome so vast it would one day define the Roman skyline. It rose slowly, inch by inch, stone by stone, a cathedral not of austerity, but of absolute grandeur. But art does not come cheap, especially when it takes decades and consumes mountains of marble. St. Peter's was swallowing funds faster than indulgences could refill them. Leo borrowed from Florentine banks, then mortgaged church lands, then sold sacred offices. At one point, even the papal tiara was pawned. He promised everyone repayment eventually, and in the meantime, he doubled down on the sale of indulgences. Art was the excuse. Indulgence was the engine. The irony is nearly Shakespearean. The most beautiful church ever built rose on the backs of peasants who couldn't read the Bible, but believed a parchment could spare their mother from purgatory. And Luther, he saw the dome as a betrayal carved in stone. Despite the frescoes, the music, the elephants, the dome, the people were turning. The Reformation spread like ink on silk. Germany, Switzerland, France, even whispers in England. Leo underestimated it all. He thought he could paint over dissent, charm away doctrine with golden chalices, but sermons in back rooms were louder than his banquets. And faith, true faith, was slipping from papal hands. Even in Rome, priests began questioning the opulence. Some fasted in protest, others vanished from their posts. The Vatican halls grew draftier, the laughter thinner. And in 1521, Leo X fell ill. He died suddenly. No grand illness, no slow withering, just gone. They say he choked on a piece of roasted peacock. Others say poison, or stroke, or heartbreak. His body was embalmed, placed beneath a fresco of St. Peter, handing Christ's keys to a pope, a painting Raphael had finished just months before. At the time of his death, the papacy was nearly bankrupt. The Reformation was in full swing. The seeds of revolution had already taken root in England and beyond. But Leo, he left behind a city of marble and color, a Vatican that still glows with the echoes of his indulgence. Some say Leo was the Pope who let Christendom fracture. Others say he was a Renaissance genius who misunderstood the times. But maybe he was both. A man of art, drowning in indulgence. A lover of beauty who failed to see the rot at the altar. His Rome remains. Tourists walk its halls, whisper in its chapels, snap photos beneath its domes. But few know that behind the frescoes, beneath the golden light, was a man who once said, "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it," and enjoy it he did. It is easy to look back with judgment, to scoff at the velvet, the swans, the sugar sculptures, to call Leo X a fool, or worse, a heretic in silk. But history is rarely so tidy, and men who hold too much power often become mirrors of their time, reflecting both its brightest light and its deepest shadows. Leo was born in a palace, raised in a city of marble, tutored by poets and surrounded by gold. He was taught that beauty was holiness, that power was divine, and that God favored grandeur. So, when he took the throne of Peter, he did not retreat into prayer. He stepped onto a stage. The Vatican became his theater, and Rome his audience. He draped the church in silk, not to hide its sins, but because he believed, truly, that a beautiful church could not possibly be corrupt. He filled its halls with music so no one would hear the cries. He built cathedrals so tall they cast shadows long enough to conceal the cracks beneath them. But shadows always shift, and cracks, in time, always widen. And when they did, they let in voices, unwelcome ones, reforming ones. Still, Leo's fingerprints remain. Walk through Rome, and you'll see them everywhere. In the gold leaf ceilings of the Vatican, in the soft blush of Raphael's Madonna, in the silent awe that still hangs in the dome of St. Peter's. These were not accidents. They were acts of faith, however flawed. Because maybe, just maybe, Leo did believe. Not in austerity, not in repentance, but in the power of beauty to redeem a broken world. And that's what makes his story linger, long after the wine is dried and the tiaras have tarnished. It wasn't just scandal, it was longing. A longing to make heaven visible, to prove, with marble and music, that God still dwelled in Rome, even if the cost was too high, even if it all came tumbling down. So tonight, if you find yourself lying awake, thinking of sugar cities and peacocks and popes who danced while the world burned, remember this: even in the wildest nights, even in the most gilded sins, there is something deeply painfully human about wanting to be remembered as more than a mistake. Leo wanted to be eternal, and in some small way, he is. Not as a saint, not as a villain, but as a man who thought the church could be saved with a paintbrush and a parade.